Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a very long overdue episode of the Boozy History of, with me, your most gracious host, Ted. Welcome to the premiere alcohol documentary series here on YouTube. This is a show, or rather a series of shorts and documentaries and such, where I go over the history of either alcohol brands or types of alcohol. So today we're going to be taking a look at a drink that I've been saying I would do one on for quite a while, which is, as you can see here, Carling, which is England's most exported beer as of current. So the reason why I originally wanted to do a boozy history of on Carling was mainly just because of the meme-worthy status of it within British drinking culture, but as I looked a bit more into it, I realised there were some similarities that it had with San Miguel. Well, more so just one in particular. Now, obviously, San Miguel was originally set up in Manila by Spanish businessmen upon decree by the Spanish government. I've gone into a bit more detail about it in the San Miguel video, but Carling is a bit of a weird one. Now, Carling was originally set up by an Englishman, a man from Yorkshire, in fact, called Thomas Carling, who we'll go into a little bit more in a moment, but he originally set up the company and the brewery for Carling in Ontario. So even though Carling is essentially an English beer, it is England's most exported beer after all, the origins of it are Canadian. So yeah, I was a bit surprised by that, but then again, I mean, I was also surprised to find out that San Miguel, while quintessentially being Spanish, is essentially, in the modern sense, a Filipino beer. And similarly, Carling is much of the same. Obviously, originally it was a Canadian brand, but now, essentially nowadays, it's much more indelibly linked to British drinking culture. After all, the main brewery is based out of Burton-on-Trent, so kind of goes without saying, really. Now, I'm trying to still find out the format of a boozy history of, but the way I'm going to format this one in particular is that I'm just going to go over a quick lightning round of some of the most notable dates in the history of Carling and the history of Thomas Carling himself, and then we're going to go into a little bit more further detail and a bit more of a deep dive kind of way on some of the more key points throughout that timeline, just to kind of get a bit of a feel of what the overall history of Carling is like. I think kind of trying to do it chronologically might make it a bit messy, although it would probably make it somewhat easier for me to make in a chronological sense, but at the same time, I feel like it's better if I go into it a bit more piece by piece here on this one. So additionally, just before we get into things, I would also just like to ask you guys at home, what are your experiences with drinking Carling, and do you have any anecdotes or stories about it, or any particular opinions or questions on it? If so, let me know in the comments section down below. But as always, let's get into the gist of things. I've got my Carling here, I've got my Greggs vegan sausage roll here, and yeah, let's get into the gist of things. Also, for context, I'm not a vegan, but I just prefer the vegan sausage rolls from Greggs. Now, as with many great northerly men of English culture and history, Thomas's story begins in the mighty county of Yorkshire, which produces many, many great men of English history, not least Sean Bean, James Milner, and that's just to name a few, really. He was born into a farming background to a William and Margaret Carling of Eton, and I did try to find a little bit of information about them, but the information on them, and in general, to be honest, Thomas's early life before emigrating from the UK to Canada was pretty sparse. But from what I could read, I kind of ascertained that Thomas emigrated to Canada in 1818 due to mainly a lack of work opportunities. Essentially, the conclusion I've come to from researching his earlier life is that he emigrated to Canada from the UK due to the lack of proper working conditions and working opportunities in both factories and also the farming industry at the time. See, England was wrought in the Industrial Revolution, or at least the beginnings of it at the time, and so while technology was advancing at a breakneck pace, which made, producing things on farms a lot quicker and easier, it also streamlined the process of labour on the farms, meaning that many men in Thomas's case had to go and work in factories in big cities like Leeds and Hull and what have you. But the downside of that was that at the time, many of the working conditions and hours in those particular industries were not great at all. So, to be fair, when you look at him and you think, well, could he have made something out of this situation instead of taking the massive leap of emigrating all the way over onto the other side of the world to Canada? to be fair, I mean, his chances back in England weren't great, and so I kind of empathise with him in that sense. And so, after emigrating to Canada in 1818, Thomas then set up the first Carling brewery in London, Ontario in 1840, and about 10 years later he passed control of the original brewery to his two sons. Around about 1870, from what I could tell from my research, is when Carling started to become more of an established brand within Canada, and thus started at least cementing its immediate financial security for the foreseeable future. So I tended to kind of try and link specific events to specific dates when I tried to research these videos, but I couldn't find the exact date when Carling started to become more and more popular. It's more so just that it seems to have become more popular in Canada in a broad sense around 1870. That being said, while obviously Carling today is widely associated, and well, to be honest, mostly associated with light, crisp lagers like this one, originally it was primarily centred around making porters and, well, dark beers, so in a weird way, the beast from 1870 is a completely different one from today. It's still a brewery that produces other types of beers, but I mean, if you look at their output from today compared to what it was in 1870, it's a completely different case of like chalk and cheese, essentially. One thing I also did find out as well is that in 1873, Thomas essentially had a town named after him in Canada, so I did a little bit more looking into this, and while it doesn't really link into the history of Carling itself as a brand or as a brewery, it's just quite interesting to look into. What I'm saying is that in 1873, a survey was carried out on the eastern shore of Georgian Bay, with the township that was established from this venture eventually being named Carling. It's a pretty standard, straightforward name, so it's... don't know what else you would call it, really, to be honest. I couldn't find out a lot of information about the town of Carling in Canada, but from what I could see online, it looks like a pretty nice area. I could be completely wrong, but at least the natural environment around it looks nice anyway. A few years after this, in 1878, Thomas's two sons, John and William, established the second brewery of Carling in London, Ontario. Although the history of that one is shrouded in it being, well, basically burning down very shortly after it was set up, and from what I could ascertain, I think it may have impacted someone's health, because it's a bit frustrating, because even though there's clear indication of what the early history was like for Carling, some of the finer details like that are a little bit hard to come by, or at least not particularly well reported on, so I did try to find out as much information as I could, but yeah, it was just a bit sparse, I'm afraid. And after that earlier survey I mentioned about the township of Carling, the actual township that eventually bore the name Carling was eventually set up in 1897 by the magistrate Patrick McCurry. Well, I mean, he didn't set it up a bit, he basically made the announcement of the establishment of the township, so he was involved in the establishment of it anyway. Unfortunately, in 1911, John, after being made a Sir, unfortunately passed away, and in 1830 the brewery was sold to Canadian Breweries Limited. This isn't a massive cornerstone at the time, but I think the ramifications it has for the history of Carling kind of marks it out as being, in my opinion, probably the second or third most important point in the history of Carling, alongside the original founding or establishment of the original brewery. Canadian Breweries Limited was established as well by a man called E.P. Taylor, and at the time it was a conglomerate of about 30 other breweries, so it's definitely not like Carling were joining a new upstart coming business venture. They were joining someone who was very well established, so by this point it definitely seems like the brewery was on its way on the up and up. And in 1932, after joining BCO, Carling established itself and started selling its product in the USA as well as Canada. In 1934, the Toronto-based O'Keefe Brewery was acquired, and during the 1960s, Carling Red Cap becomes the most popular beer brand, from Carling at least, in Ontario. In 1969, Canadian Breweries Limited was sold to Rothmans. In 1973, we got the establishment of a new sub-brewery called Carling O'Keefe, and in 1989, Molson buys the parent company of Carling, and thus it brings us to 2005, which is the date from which Carling was under the ownership of Molson Coors, which, as far as I can see, it still is today, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So if I am incorrect, I do apologise about that. But The history of Carling is a pretty steady one of business progression and business growth, whereas San Miguel's was one of growth combined with political tension, corruption from the Filipino government, and is definitely a little bit more chaotic. Carling's is a little bit more straightforward, although that definitely doesn't mean that it's still without its bumps and slight oddities, which we're going to get into a bit now.
Alright, nice one.
Now, the first of the individual stories I wanted to look at about the history of Carling is not necessarily related to the beer itself, but I just wanted to put it in here as kind of like a little breaker to kind of sort of cleanse the palate before we get into the other stories about the history of the brewery. But it's just weird and quite dark, but also a little bit funny as well. I'm not gonna lie, it's kind of weird and scary, but it's also very funny in a weird way. So, in 1927, Carling offered $25,000 to the first fully successful flight from London, Ontario to London in England. Now, this sounds like quite an interesting idea to pull off, but then you remember the actual distance, or at least flight distance, between these two places, which was quite a distance without modern airplane technology in 1927, and this was kind of highlighted quite a bit when the two men who decided to take up the challenge, namely Captain Terry Tully and his associate Lieutenant James Metcalf, they decided to do the journey in a very early model airplane which was called the Stinson Detroiter. Now, this piece of machinery and the multiple models of it were groundbreaking in the world of aerodynamics and aeroplane industry technology, but to say that it would have been able to make that entire journey from London to London without any hiccups, so long as nothing went wrong, is obviously putting things in the hands of chance a bit. But then you also consider that the max range of this plane was about 3,600 miles, or at least that's the case for the original SM1 version of this particular aeroplane. Now, keep in mind that the flight distance between London, Ontario and London in Greater London in the UK is actually a bit longer than that. In fact, the flight distance is actually closer to roughly around 3,656 miles, so yeah. Now, granted, there could have obviously been alterations that they could have made to the plane that would have made that journey a bit easier, and I kind of appreciate their, buccaneering attitude and their ambition, but that does just seem like a bit of a risk, I'm not going to lie. But then again, we've also got to keep in mind this is at a time when aeroplane technology was very much in its infancy. The first time that aeroplanes had been used in a combat role was as recently as 1912, so it's very much a case of the technology was still in its infancy, and so maybe they might not have had the full clue of what they were doing with some of the finer minutiae of aeroplanes and how they were meant to be flown. But the problem is that once they reached Newfoundland, they then went over the North Atlantic and disappeared. I'm not really sure where they've gone. I tried to research it a bit more, but it genuinely does seem like they disappeared. So essentially, Carling puts up $25,000 for these two poor schmucks to make this great buccaneering, ambitious, brave journey, and they just vanished. It's funny, but it's also scary, because what happened to them? It's kind of like the mystery around the Voyager journey of Erebus and Terror, if you've ever heard about that. They were two experimental exploration ships set out by the British to explore the air around the North Atlantic, particularly when you get into the ice straits going into Canada. And yeah, it didn't go too well. Basically, the crews essentially disappeared, and there's a really good, although somewhat fictionalized, TV miniseries that's based off of a book about it. But yeah, that was also a bit lost to the ether, as we shall say. The next touchstone point of Carling's history that I wanted to look at was the legacy of the late great E.P. Taylor, who, while obviously not the most fundamental character in the history of Carling, that would obviously have to be Carling himself. I mean, it kind of goes without saying. E.P. Taylor is still a massively important figure in the history of both the brewery and the company. While he did see the transition from Carling into becoming a brewery that would make equally as much like crisp lagers as it did dark beers and porters. The main thing he's credited for is turning Carling into a national brand within Canada, and then eventually translating that success into it becoming a well-known and respected brand in the US. And then from there through to the former and current Commonwealth and British Empire countries, and of course the UK as well. One of the biggest things he did see over was the popularisation of Carling Redcap, which for a long period of time was the most popular beer in Ontario, Canada. It did fall off eventually throughout the 60s and 70s, and it did have a bit of a brief revival in 1994, but it didn't really go anywhere in that sense, and so it just kind of died out. It does sound like an interesting business venture though, so I would like to maybe do a bit more interesting research into that. There's also a pub called E.P. Taylor's Pub and Restaurant on a college campus in Oshawa, Ontario, so if I ever go to that part of the world, I would like to visit there just to see what it's like. Even more so than being a legend in the history of business and brewing, one of the most key things that he's known for though is being an absolute icon in the history of horse breeding and horse racing. In 1953, he began talks with the Hope and Anchor Brewery from Sheffield, which led Carling into becoming a key mainstay of British drinking culture. Now, keep in mind, Carling had been in the UK for a while before this point, but I kind of see this as being the point where Carling really went into overdrive in terms of being a cornerstone of British drinking and British drinking culture, and thus obviously leading on to it becoming England's most exported beer. While E.P. Taylor's legacy does deserve to be dived into in a little bit more further context, perhaps in another video, it has to be said that without John Carling, E.P. Taylor's probably the most important figure in the history of the brewery, in my opinion. Now, keep in mind that while we've obviously mainly touched on the success of Carling in Canada, America and the UK so far, like I said a moment ago, it is still obviously very popular throughout the other Commonwealth and former British Empire countries. For example, in Australia and South Africa, in addition to Canada, there is also the popularity of Carling Black Label. It was referred to, or at least Carling Black Label was sold in Ireland and the UK up until 1997, but now it's just known simply as Carling. Although I did see that in Sweden they sell Carling Premier, or at least they did at one point anyway. One particular notable slogan that was used to sell Carling Black Label throughout the Empire countries though was Hey Mabel Black Label, which, yeah, nice ring to it. It's a decent rhyme, but it just doesn't really leave that much of an impression on me, to be honest, as far as slogans go. One interesting thing I did see about the history and the slang sort of status of Carling Black Label is that in South Africa, it has the name Zamalek. Now, you might be thinking, why does it have a clearly Arabic name in South Africa as a beer? So the reason for that is that the colours of Carling Black Label in South Africa were red and black, and there is a football team in Egypt called Zamalek whose kit colours are, well, black and red. And so over time the street slang kind of way of referring to Carling in South Africa, not in all cases obviously, but in a lot, has ended up in it being referred to as Zamalek. So I don't know, it's just quite an interesting thing to note. And obviously if any South African viewers are watching this, please expunge a bit more on that and let me know what else you want to tell us about the status of Carling in South Africa. Now, while I've touched on the history of Carling in the UK a little bit, I did want to delve into it a little bit more before we go into the last two key points of Carling's history that I wanted to touch on. And even though, like I've said, Carling is essentially a Canadian brand, its link to British drinking culture is borderline fundamental, in my opinion. I mean, keep in mind, Carling was first exported back to the UK from London, Ontario in 1864, so even though, like I said, it became more and more popular throughout the 1950s and 1960s, again, it had been around already for a long, long time before that. As far as I could see from the statistics that I read as well, that as recently as early 2021, Carling is still the most widely bought beer in UK pubs, which is quite astounding really when you consider the competition that it now has nowadays from not just craft breweries, but many, many, many imported foreign beers from across, well, not just Europe, but around the world. To be fair though, I mean, it's still very popular domestically and globally, so it's not like it's founded on nothing. It is very much a basic beer, but I mean, I guess that basicness and general accessibility in terms of its flavour palette and feel is kind of part of the reason why it's so popular. Originally though, much like a lot of breweries in England that were based out of London, the beer that Carling made originally had its ties to obviously dark beers like porters, as I mentioned earlier. And this came from how many breweries in London at the time used semi-hard water to brew their beers. Now, semi-hard water is natural to a lot of the UK and is easier for brewing hoppy beers, so with stuff like, dark beers and porters, it is useful, but the eventual translation of Carling in the UK translating to lighter, crisper lagers like this one comes from where the UK brewery of Carling was set up in Burton-on-Trent. Now, keep in mind, Burton-on-Trent is surrounded by a large number of waterways which connect the town not just to other water sources, but to a lot of the UK actually. And these waterways were pretty critical, at least in the early days of the brewery, in transporting the beer quickly along raft boats and ferries along and up and down the UK so that it could be more easily distributed. Now, keep in mind as well that the water supply around Burton, at least in the local area, contains a pretty high amount of gypsum. And, well, you might be wondering, what the hell is gypsum? This isn't a biology class. Well, it's a pretty interesting substance because it's a soft sulfate mineral which is actually found in the sandstone surface, so this does mean that Burton's water supply is pretty high in dissolved minerals. You might be wondering, well, why is that important and how does that tie into Carling and how that's made? Well, it's because it means that it's ideal for brewing lighter beers like IPAs and Carling, or, well, lager, which is obviously what the brand is more well known for nowadays. Minerals have a positive influence on the hops that are used in the brewing process, and the nutrients found in the water in this local area also allow for the protection of yeasts and the removal of unwanted proteins from the brewing yeasts. So the actual minerals in the water are equally as important as the accessibility that water then entails, or at least the geographical formulation of how that water has formed and how it enabled beer to be distributed throughout the UK domestically. It really does have to be said, or at least it can't be understated, how much the importance of the waterways around Burton are to the eventual success of Carling, at least as a UK brand anyway. It's really, really important, and I do want to go into it a little bit more, but at the very least, this is more of like an overall view of the history of Carling, but definitely the history of Burton-on-Trent is quite interesting actually, even if a bit understated. So yeah, I definitely would like to do more history on that soon as well. So similar to San Miguel and obviously Carlsberg Special Brew, Carling does have a point of controversy in its history, and in this case it did come quite recently in fact. In 2017 there was a controversy that was brought up by Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, or HMRC, or as it's now known, His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and this claimed that the firm of Carling in the UK had underpaid tax by about 50 million between the 1st of September 2012 and the 31st of January 2015. Now, the firm did eventually win this case and didn't have to pay back the £50 million because it argued that the beer it was selling wasn't necessarily subject to the same taxation rules as other beers that were being produced in the UK. Keep in mind that beer in the UK is taxed at a higher rate if the alcohol percentage is over 4%. Keep in mind that Carling is brewed at a level between 3.7% and 4.3%, which the firm advised was done to keep the beer under tax level. Now, this might sound a bit strange because you're thinking, well, hang on, if it was brewed at a range of up to 4.3% alcohol volume, then how would it still be kept underneath that tax level if the tax level is for beers that are over 4.0%? Well, this is when EU law comes into it, and it's a bit of a weird one. So to just make it as quick as possible, EU law also permits that beer can have a natural variation of brewing of 0.5%, which the firm of Carling in the UK used to justify the point that it wasn't undercutting its customers and that it wasn't brewing the beer at a rate that was over the 4.0% alcohol percentage threshold. So in a technical sense, they weren't really breaking any rules. The papers from the trials and the inquiries seem to imply that someone from Moores Coulson also may have implied that it wasn't clearly advertised on their branding and marketing, at least in order to make sure that, distributors and pubs didn't claim a much larger piece of the funds that were saved from the beer not being taxed as much. Although I wouldn't put 100% of my chips on that, and I couldn't fully verify that claim, although it does seem to be claimed in at least a couple of places. Now, to be fair, from a business perspective, Carling's stance on this, or at least the firm's stance on this, I should say, is understandable. However, it kind of sets a funny precedence for me in my head, or at least a theoretical precedence, in that if we're being able to justify the slight mistruth of the extent to which it was brewed at the ABV in order to save money, then what does that mean for the consumer base that consumes this on a daily basis? And I don't know, it's just a bit of a messy one, really. So I definitely do more reading into it in your own time, because it's quite an interesting subject. It brings up some interesting moral quandaries about advertisement, alcohol brewing, and tax. So it is a definitely interesting subject. Oh yeah, I meant to put in a funny video for the transition for this bit, but to be honest, this next section talks about Carling's involvement in the sponsorship of football events. So if that's really not your interest or your area of knowledge, or you just don't want to hear about it, then skip to the timestamp on screen if you just want to avoid this bit. Also, just as a quick aside, at one point Carling did sponsor both Glasgow Rangers and Glasgow Celtic, which is interesting because they don't particularly like each other, so that was quite interesting. But additionally, Carling did also sponsor the English League Cup competition from 2003 to 2012, and I've got a special talent in that I can name the scoreline and participating teams of every League Cup final in England from 2000 up to today. So I'm going to quickly wrap around a scarf around my head so you guys can be assured I'm not going to be looking at any notes or cheating, and I'm going to name off the teams and scorelines of the League Cup finals during that period without checking any notes. Bear with me one sec. Alright, nice one. Okay. Alright, where's the headset? Here we are. Okay, and yes, for context, I'm fully aware that Charlton aren't very good. They're the team I support, they're the team that my family supports, so deal with it. So, anyway, first up, the 03-04 final. Middlesbrough 2, Bolton 1. 2004-05 final, Chelsea 3, Liverpool 2. 2005-06 final, Man United 4, Wigan Athletic 0. 2006-07 final, Chelsea 2, Arsenal 1. I believe the 06-07 final might have actually been the first time that Theo Walcott ever scored for Arsenal, so that was quite interesting. Probably didn't fully deserve to go to the 2006 World Cup over Darren Bent, in my opinion, but it's also a crying shame that he wasn't taken to the 2010 World Cup, because that was probably when he was in his best form for the Gunners. 07-08 final, Tottenham 2, Chelsea 1, Tottenham's first trophy in 9 years. Also the last trophy they've won as of me recording this video. Oh, that club must be so frustrating to support, goodness me. 08-09 final, Tottenham 0, Man United 0, Man United win on penalties. 09-10 final, Man United 2, Aston Villa 1. If you get a match to watch from the 09-10 season to entertain yourself, I definitely recommend watching the two legs of the League Cup semi-final between Aston Villa and Blackburn Rovers. That was mental. Honestly, goals. Just a crazy couple of games. 0-10-11 final. Probably one of the most embarrassing moments in Arsenal's history, when they lost 2-1 in the dying moments to Birmingham City, who themselves would end up getting relegated that season anyway.
And it goes again towards the towering Zigic. All confusion and Martin.
And then 2011-12 final, Liverpool 2, Cardiff City 2, Liverpool win on penalties. Probably one of the most scuffed finals, although I do remember Dirk Kuyt scoring an absolute banger of a goal for Liverpool. So it was an entertaining game, to be sure. Yeah, there you go. Obsessive football trivia being my party trick for the last several years, as sponsored by Carling. Well, not really, but yeah. I've got to have a bit. Oh my god, I wrapped that way too tight around my eyes. Oh my word. Hey, sorry for the poor mic quality. I'm afraid you guys might just have to deal with it for a couple of minutes, because I recorded this a couple of days after I recorded the rest of the video, and to be honest, I just can't be bothered to get out the good microphone for this last bit, so apologies about that. But then again, ending the year on inconsistency is kind of par for the course for 2024, so I guess I'm kind of just staying consistently inconsistent, let's just say that. But before we finish, I did want to go over one question that my mate Owen, who you guys will have seen in a number of Ted's Booze Cellar episodes in the past, asked me, which is, why does Carling have a similarly rough reputation associated with alcohol-related crime, rough and disorderly behaviour, and the lot of that, as, say, something like Stella Artois or Carlsberg Special Brew? I did go into this a little bit in the Carlsberg Special Brew documentary some time ago, but Carlsberg Special Brew and drinks like Stella Artois that have at times in the past had an ABV of at least 7 or 8% have generally been associated with a lot of alcohol-related crime here in the UK, and also a lot of drunken disorderly behaviour out on the streets. Particularly as I remember it, I did see a lot of people with cans of Carlsberg Special Brew at bus stops being a bit disorderly and drunk when I was going to school in the late 90s and the early 2000s. So these drinks can carry with them a bit of a strange reputation, shall we just say. Granted, with Stella Artois, I think its reputation has improved in recent years because it has become increasingly weaker over time, but at the same time it does still obviously carry an air of it being a bit of a wife-beater beer from what I would argue is internet culture and memes at this point. But to be fair, during the early 2000s and the 90s it definitely was warranted to some degree, although it is still definitely warranted, I would argue, as much as the same for Carlsberg Special Brew nowadays, because Carlsberg Special Brew is a weird one in that it's quite expensive and also strong, but still a lot of people drink it when they're in the sitch. But with Carling, it's a bit of a stranger one because it's weaker than both those beers, and generally speaking, most places it does tend to be a bit cheaper as well. It's cheap and it's inexpensive, so why does it have, as Owen said, a similarly poor reputation that's associated with alcohol-related crime? And I do think that partly because it's not taxed quite as much as the other beers, it is obviously going to be a lot more accessible down to price. That being said, it's also not so strong that it's going to get you absolutely smashed. So I think in a weird way, maybe people are kind of encouraged to drink a lot more of it because A, it's cheaply accessible, and it's also not going to smash you straight away. So someone will be, I want a drink, I'm going to have this, that was nice and refreshing, it won't be too bad if I then pick up another, and so on and so forth. And before you've realised it, you've drunk down 11 pints of this stuff, and you're in the middle of the town square in Sheffield during the Sheffield Derby, and you're running around shirtless in the middle of the city. So obviously you're going to get your knackers beaten in, but at the same time, yeah, I don't know. I can't say this definitely has quite the same bad reputation as something like Carlsberg Special Brew, but I do understand the question for sure. Now, I'm just going to go to the gym really quick, but I thought that I might as well provide a quick update on my thoughts on Carling because I haven't tried it in quite a while. Now, keep in mind, the canned version is definitely a bit different to the draft one, and it has been a while since I've had this, so hopefully it will still be fairly good. Now, Carling is a fairly hoppy light lager, and it generally doesn't leave that much of an impression with me in terms of its flavour or smell. But like I said, it's been a while since I've had it, so what could be the harm in, trying a little tipple before you go to the gym? Yeah, I definitely should have chilled this. This isn't great. Actually, it's definitely better than I remember it being. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and if you've enjoyed anything I've watched throughout the year, or you've enjoyed this video in particular, do let me know in the comments section down below what you particularly liked or you may have agreed or disagreed with, as well as a like, share and subscribe. Now, I know that this year my video upload has been very inconsistent, and that is something that I do want to aim to work on in the coming new year. I expect to upload this video either on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, but just in case I don't get a chance, I will be seeing you guys all in the year of our Lord 2025. Don't know why I keep saying that, I'm not even religious, but I want to say that despite the fact that my upload schedule has been very inconsistent this year, I want to say thank you still to everyone who's continued watching despite my inconsistencies. It is very much appreciated, and to everyone who's left suggestions, comments or anything like that, again, massively appreciate it. It's really honestly, it does mean a lot. Like, even if it's just one person on one video, Appreciate it. Just as long as you're not calling me a bald peanut head, but to be fair, I'm not going to get mad about that because it's unfortunately kind of true. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, like I said, leave a like, share and subscribe. If you want to check out any of my other stuff online, I'll leave the links to all that in the video description down below. And until next time and next year, have fun, stay safe with whatever you're doing, don't do anything I wouldn't do, wash your hands, drink responsibly, know your limits, and I'll see you guys at the bar next time on Ted's Booze Cellar. Glorious, glorious English beer. Still prefer Harvey's Best Bitter though, to be honest.